It's 11 p.m. on a Wednesday night in Birmingham, Alabama, and 17-year-old Madison is sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, phone in hand, tears streaming down her face. She's just discovered that her youth pastor, the man who baptized her 3 years ago, the one who preached about sexual purity every Sunday, has been quietly transferred to another church after allegations of inappropriate conduct with a teenage girl. This is the third youth leader at her church in 2 years to suddenly disappear without explanation. The congregation was told he was following God's calling elsewhere. No apology, no acknowledgement, just silence, covered with a thin layer of spiritual language that's supposed to make everyone forget and move on. Madison isn't moving on, and she's not alone. Across the Bible Belt, a generation raised on VeggieTales, Hillsong worship, and Wednesday night youth group is walking away from the institution that shaped their entire childhood. But here's what makes this different from every other generational shift in religious participation. They're not leaving quietly. They're creating TikToks with millions of views, writing viral Twitter threads, and building entire online communities dedicated to exposing what they call the rot at the foundation of American evangelicalism. And the receipts they're bringing aren't just philosophical disagreements or cultural evolution. They're screenshots, leaked emails, financial documents, and firsthand testimonies that paint a picture so damning, even the most devout are starting to ask uncomfortable questions. This isn't a story about kids rebelling against their parents' faith. This is about an entire generation that grew up being told the church was their safe place, only to discover it was often the most dangerous place they could be. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the stories that shape our world. If you're watching this from somewhere in the Bible Belt, drop a comment and let me know where and what time it is for you right now. I'm genuinely curious how widespread this phenomenon really is across different regions. And if this channel has been providing value to you, consider leaving a super thanks. It genuinely helps us keep producing content that tackles these difficult but necessary topics. Let's rewind to understand how we got here. The Bible Belt, that stretch of the American South and Midwest where Christianity isn't just a religion, but the very fabric of social identity, has always had high church attendance. We're talking about regions where in 2008, over 75% of the population identified as Christian, where church wasn't optional, it was Tuesday, Thursday, and twice on Sunday, where your entire social network, your job prospects, and even your dating pool were determined by which church you attended. For generations, this system worked. Kids grew up in the church, got married in the church, raised their kids in the church. The cycle perpetuated itself. Then something shifted. According to a 2022 Pew Research study, religious affiliation among Americans aged 18 to 29 dropped to just 43%. But here's the kicker. The drop is steepest in the very regions that were once the most religious. In states like Tennessee, Arkansas, and Mississippi, where church attendance was practically mandatory for social survival, Gen Z attendance rates have plummeted by nearly 35% in just one decade. That's not a gradual decline, that's a mass exodus. But why? The standard narrative you'll hear from church leaders is predictable. Kids these days are too worldly, too influenced by liberal media, too addicted to their phones, too obsessed with political correctness. They've strayed from God because the culture has corrupted them. It's a convenient explanation that places blame squarely on the young people themselves and absolves the institution of any responsibility. Except Gen Z isn't buying it, and they've got evidence. Let's talk about what they're actually saying. Emma, a 21-year-old from Jackson, Mississippi, grew up in a Southern Baptist megachurch with over 3,000 members. Every Sunday, her pastor preached about helping the poor, about being Christ-like, about sacrificial giving. The church ran multiple fundraising campaigns every year, pulling in millions. Emma was taught that tithing was non-negotiable, that giving 10% of everything you earned to the church was God's command. When she was 14, she donated her entire summer job earnings, $600, to a special missionary fund. She believed she was changing lives. Then, in 2019, local investigative journalists got a hold of the church's financial records during a routine audit. The senior pastor was making $450,000 annually. The church owned 3 properties, including a lake house valued at $1.2 million, all in the pastor's name. The missionary fund Emma contributed to, 30 cents of every dollar actually went to missions. The rest went to building improvements, staff salaries, and something vaguely labeled as operational costs. When confronted by concerned members, the pastor quoted scripture about not questioning God's anointed leaders and suggested that anyone asking about finances was operating in a spirit of discord. This is the pattern Gen Z keeps encountering. Ask questions, get spiritually gaslit. The term spiritual abuse has become mainstream in these online communities, describing a specific manipulation tactic where religious authority is weaponized to control, silence, or exploit. Dr. Lisa Oakley, a researcher who spent 15 years studying religious trauma, found that 87% of individuals who left evangelical churches cited some form of spiritual manipulation as a primary factor. These aren't people who drifted away because they found church boring. These are individuals who felt actively harmed by the institution that promised to protect them. The financial exploitation is just the beginning. In 2018, the Houston Chronicle published an investigation that shook the Southern Baptist Convention to its core. Over 700 victims of sexual abuse within Southern Baptist churches over a 20-year period. The report detailed case after case of pastors, youth ministers, and church leaders who sexually abused children and adults, only to be quietly moved to different congregations when allegations surfaced. The methodology was eerily similar to what we later learned about the Catholic Church crisis. Protect the institution at all costs, even if it means protecting predators. But here's what made the Southern Baptist crisis particularly devastating for Gen Z. These were the same churches that had spent decades preaching about sexual purity culture. Girls like Madison were given purity rings at 13, told their virginity was a gift they could only give once, that their bodies were not their own but belonged first to God and eventually to their future husbands. Boys were taught that women's bodies were dangerous temptations, that even looking at a girl with desire was equivalent to adultery. The culture created a bizarre obsession with teenage sexuality while simultaneously creating perfect conditions for abuse to flourish unchecked. Joshua, now 23 and living in Dallas, was homeschooled in a conservative Christian household in rural Georgia. He attended a church that preached extensively about the dangers of homosexuality, calling it an abomination, a choice, a sin that needed to be repented from. When Joshua was 15, he confessed to his youth pastor that he was experiencing same-sex attraction. The pastor immediately enrolled him in a conversion therapy program run by a Christian counseling center affiliated with the church. For 8 months, Joshua attended twice-weekly sessions where he was told his attractions were demonic, that he could be cured through prayer and behavioral modification. The psychological techniques included aversion therapy, where Joshua was shown images of men and told to associate them with pain or disgust. It didn't work. Of course it didn't work. Conversion therapy has been discredited by every major medical and psychological organization, including the American Psychological Association, which found it not only ineffective but actively harmful, leading to increased rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide. But Joshua's church didn't care about the medical consensus. They cared about maintaining their theological position, even if it destroyed a teenager in the process. Joshua eventually attempted suicide at 16. He survived, left home at 18, and has been in therapy for 5 years trying to undo the damage. His story isn't unique. The Trevor Project found that LGBTQ youth who underwent conversion therapy were more than twice as likely to attempt suicide compared to those who didn't. And yet, as of 2023, conversion therapy is still legal in 28 states, often protected under religious freedom laws. Churches continue to practice it, continue to tell young people their identities are sins that need correcting. This is the cognitive dissonance Gen Z is grappling with. They grew up with internet access, with information at their fingertips, with the ability to fact-check every claim. They can see that countries with the highest levels of social acceptance for LGBTQ individuals also have the lowest suicide rates among LGBTQ youth. They can see that every credible medical organization says conversion therapy is harmful. They can see the data, the studies, the evidence. And then they go to church on Sunday and hear the exact opposite from the pulpit, packaged in spiritual language designed to discourage questioning. The political entanglement is another breaking point. In 2016, 81% of white evangelical voters supported Donald Trump. Let that sink in. 81% of a demographic that had spent decades preaching about moral character, about the sanctity of marriage, about sexual purity, about personal integrity, voted for a man who bragged about sexual assault on tape, who'd been married 3 times, who paid hush money to a porn star. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on young evangelicals who'd been told their entire lives that character mattered, that moral leadership was paramount. Sarah, a 19-year-old from Tennessee, remembers her pastor dedicating an entire sermon series in 1998 to why Bill Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky proved he was unfit for leadership. Character matters, her pastor thundered from the pulpit. A man who can't be faithful to his wife can't be trusted to lead our nation. 18 years later, that same pastor organized a voter registration drive explicitly to support Trump's candidacy. When Sarah pointed out the inconsistency, she was told she didn't understand the complexity of politics, that God uses imperfect vessels, that this was about protecting religious freedom. But Gen Z saw something else. The church wasn't principled, it was political. The moral standards were negotiable depending on whether the person in question advanced the church's power and influence. It wasn't about following Jesus, it was about maintaining control. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated everything. When government officials recommended limiting gathering sizes to slow viral transmission, many evangelical churches framed it as religious persecution. Pastors defied health orders, holding massive in-person services while hospitals overflowed. John MacArthur, pastor of Grace Community Church in California, became a hero in many evangelical circles for refusing to comply with gathering restrictions, framing it as an issue of government overreach into religious practice. But Gen Z saw people dying. They saw healthcare workers begging people to take basic precautions. They saw grandparents on ventilators, and they saw their churches more concerned with making a political statement than protecting vulnerable people. Multiple studies have since shown that counties with higher rates of religious service attendance had significantly higher COVID transmission rates in 2020 and 2021. The data suggests thousands of preventable deaths occurred because churches prioritized in-person gathering over public health. Then there's the racism issue. The Bible Belt has a complicated history with race, to put it mildly. Many of the large evangelical denominations, including the Southern Baptist Convention, were explicitly founded on defending slavery. The SBC was created in 1845 specifically because Northern Baptists opposed slavery while Southern Baptists defended it as biblically justified. That legacy didn't just disappear. It evolved, mutated, adapted to each era's social norms, but the underlying structure remained. Gen Z grew up during Black Lives Matter. They watched George Floyd murdered on video. They watched Breonna Taylor killed in her own home. They watched Ahmaud Arbery hunted down and shot while jogging. And then many of them went to church on Sunday and heard their pastors say nothing. Or worse, heard them criticize the protests, invoke law and order rhetoric, post "All Lives Matter" on social media. When young members asked why the church wasn't speaking out against racial injustice, they were told the church should stay out of politics. The same church that had spent decades heavily involved in politics whenever the issues were abortion or gay marriage, suddenly believed in separation of church and politics when it came to police brutality. Marcus, a 22-year-old black man from Atlanta, grew up in a predominantly white evangelical church. His family was one of only 3 black families in a congregation of 800. After George Floyd's death, Marcus asked if the church could organize a prayer vigil or make a statement acknowledging racial injustice. The response from leadership was that they didn't want to be divisive, that the church's mission was spiritual, not political, that all lives matter to God. 3 weeks later, that same church held a special service dedicated to praying for protection for police officers. The message was clear. Black lives didn't matter enough to even mention, but blue lives did. Marcus left the church. So did his family. They now attend a historically black church where their experiences are acknowledged, where their pain isn't dismissed as political, where the legacy of racism is confronted rather than ignored. This is happening across the Bible Belt in ways that are statistically significant. Research from sociologist Robert Jones found that white evangelical churches are becoming even more racially segregated than they were a decade ago, even as America overall becomes more diverse. The gap between what churches preach about unity and what they practice is widening, and Gen Z sees it clearly. Let's talk about women. Complementarian theology, the belief that men and women have different but complementary roles with men as leaders and women as supporters, is dominant in evangelical circles. Women can serve in children's ministry, in hospitality, in administrative support, but not as pastors, not as elders, not in authoritative teaching positions over men. This is presented as biblical, as God's design for order and harmony. But Gen Z women are asking why God's design looks suspiciously like the patriarchal structures that have oppressed women throughout history. They're reading the Bible for themselves and finding women prophets like Deborah, women apostles like Junia, women who funded Jesus' ministry, women who were the first witnesses to the resurrection. They're asking why, if women were good enough to be the first evangelists of the gospel, they're not good enough to preach on Sunday morning. And they're noticing the consequences of complementarian theology. Beth Moore, one of the most prominent women in evangelical Christianity, with decades of respected Bible teaching, was effectively pushed out of the Southern Baptist Convention in 2021 after she criticized the treatment of women in the church and spoke out about supporting abuse survivors. Moore, who'd spent her entire adult life serving the SBC, who'd never preached to men on Sunday mornings, who'd stayed within all the theological boundaries the denomination set for women, was still too much when she started asking questions. If Beth Moore isn't safe, if a woman who did everything right can still be discarded the moment she challenges male authority, what hope do younger women have? They're looking at the options presented to them. Submit to male authority, stay silent about injustice, accept secondary status in the institution, or leave. Increasingly, they're choosing to leave. The purity culture damage is coming into full focus now that Gen Z is old enough to articulate it. Linda K. Klein's book, Pure, documented the psychological harm of evangelical purity culture, interviewing dozens of women who grew up in it. The findings are devastating. Higher rates of sexual dysfunction in marriage, inability to enjoy sex even in the context the church approved of, anxiety disorders, depression, distorted body image, and a deep-seated shame about their own bodies and desires that therapy takes years to undo. Young women were told that dressing modestly was their responsibility to help men avoid lustful thoughts, that wearing a tank top could cause a brother to stumble, that their bodies were potential stumbling blocks. The message internalized was clear: you are responsible for men's thoughts and actions. If something happens to you, you probably caused it by what you wore, how you acted, where you were. This same theology creates environments where abuse flourishes. When women are taught from childhood that male authority is ordained by God, that submission is virtue, that questioning leadership is rebellion, they're being groomed for exploitation. The data bears this out. A 2017 study published in the Journal of Religion and Health found that religious women take significantly longer to leave abusive relationships and are more likely to return to abusers, largely because of theological beliefs about submission, the sanctity of marriage, and the importance of keeping families together. Gen Z has access to the testimonies. They've read the stories of women trapped in abusive marriages, counseled by pastors to pray more, submit more, be a better wife so their husband won't hit them. They've read accounts of women sexually assaulted by church leaders, then interrogated about what they were wearing, whether they'd been flirtatious, what they'd done to invite the attention. They're connecting the dots between the theology they were taught and the abuse it enabled. The intellectual dishonesty is another breaking point. Many evangelical churches promote young earth creationism, the belief that the earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, that evolution is a lie, that dinosaurs and humans coexisted. Gen Z learns this in Sunday school, at church camp, in Christian homeschool curricula. Then they go to public high school or college and learn actual geology, biology, physics, cosmology. They learn that we can measure the age of rocks, that we can observe evolution happening, that the scientific consensus based on overwhelming evidence contradicts what their church taught them. When they bring these questions back to church, they're often told that scientists are biased, that the secular world hates God, that they need to choose between faith and science. It's presented as a binary: believe the Bible or believe science. For many Gen Z kids who've grown up with information access, who can see the evidence for themselves, this false dichotomy falls apart. They realize they weren't given honest information. They were given propaganda designed to keep them inside an ideological bubble. Ken Ham's Creation Museum and Ark Encounter in Kentucky are tourist destinations for many evangelical families, presenting scientifically discredited claims as fact, showing dinosaurs alongside humans, claiming the Grand Canyon was formed during Noah's flood. For kids who later learn actual geology and biology, the realization that their entire church community took them to what amounts to a scientifically fraudulent attraction is jarring. It raises the question, what else did they lie about? The anti-intellectualism runs deeper than creationism. Many evangelical communities are deeply suspicious of higher education, viewing universities as places where faith goes to die. Young people are discouraged from attending secular colleges, warned about professors who will attack their beliefs, told that true wisdom comes from the Bible, not from worldly knowledge. Some churches even create their own colleges to keep young people in the ideological ecosystem. But Gen Z values education. They see the correlation between education and economic opportunity. They see that countries with higher educational attainment have better health outcomes, lower crime, higher quality of life. They see their pastors warning them away from the very institutions that could expand their opportunities. And they're asking why. Why would God be threatened by knowledge? Why would faith require ignorance? The environmental crisis is another wedge issue. Gen Z is growing up watching wildfires, hurricanes, droughts, and rising sea levels. They're reading the scientific consensus on climate change. They're inheriting a planet in crisis. And many of their churches either deny climate change exists or claim it doesn't matter, because Jesus is coming back soon anyway. The theology of the rapture, the belief that Christians will be supernaturally removed from earth before things get really bad, creates a perverse incentive to not care about long-term planetary health. Young evangelicals are recognizing this as a theological problem with serious real-world consequences. If your theology tells you the earth is temporary and will be destroyed anyway, why implement environmental protections? Why transition to renewable energy? Why care about conservation? This isn't abstract anymore. Gen Z is living through what older generations set in motion, and they're angry that the institution that claims to care about all of God's creation often votes for politicians with the worst environmental records. The mental health crisis within evangelical communities is finally getting attention. For decades, mental illness was spiritualized. Depression was a lack of faith. Anxiety was not trusting God enough. The solution was always more prayer, more Bible study, more faith. Actual mental health treatment, therapy, and especially psychiatric medication were viewed with suspicion or outright hostility. Mental illness was reframed as spiritual warfare, as demonic oppression, as sin that needed to be repented from. Gen Z has grown up during a mental health awareness revolution. They know depression is a medical condition. They know anxiety disorders are neurological. They know therapy works. They know medication can be life-saving. And when they try to access these resources, many face resistance from their faith communities. Churches that will pay for mission trips won't help with therapy costs. Pastors recommend prayer instead of counseling. Young people suffering from serious mental illness are told their problem is spiritual, not medical. The consequences are tragic. Suicide rates among evangelical youth have risen significantly over the past 2 decades particularly among LGBTQ youth and conservative religious communities. The Trevor Project's research shows that LGBTQ youth who come from highly religious families are more than 3 times as likely to attempt suicide compared to those from non-religious families. The theology meant to save them is killing them. We need to talk about the money. The prosperity gospel has infected huge swaths of American evangelicalism. Preachers like Joel Osteen, Joyce Meyer, and Kenneth Copeland promise that faith will result in material wealth, that God wants you rich, that if you're struggling financially, it's because you lack faith or aren't giving enough to the church. This theology is biblically dubious and psychologically destructive. Joel Osteen's net worth is estimated at $60 million. He lives in a $10.5 million mansion in Houston. His church takes in over $43 million in donations annually. Kenneth Copeland is worth $300 million and owns multiple private jets. When asked why he needed a private jet, Copeland said a flying commercial was like being in a long tube with a bunch of demons. These are the people telling working-class Americans that they need to give more money to the church in order to receive God's blessing. Gen Z sees the scam. They watch their parents faithfully tithing while struggling to pay medical bills, while their pastor drives a Range Rover and wears a Rolex. They see the multi-million-dollar church buildings while congregants lose their homes. They see the celebrity pastors living in luxury while preaching about storing up treasures in heaven. The cognitive dissonance is deafening. Carl Lentz, the former pastor of Hillsong Church's New York branch, became a celebrity pastor, friends with Justin Bieber and other celebrities, known for his expensive sneakers and trendy style. He was fired in 2020 for moral failures, which turned out to be multiple affairs, abuse of power, and financial impropriety. Lentz had positioned himself as a hip, relevant voice for young Christians. His fall was one more example of leaders preaching one thing and living another. What's remarkable about the Gen Z exodus is that it's not passive. Previous generations who left the church often just drifted away quietly. Gen Z is actively deconstructing, documenting, and warning others. The hashtag #JoshExvangelical has millions of posts, creating a community of people processing their religious trauma, sharing their stories, finding solidarity. These aren't bitter screeds. They're thoughtful, often painful accounts of people who genuinely believed, who tried to make it work, who gave their churches every benefit of the doubt until the evidence became undeniable. Rhett and Link, the YouTube creators with over 5 million subscribers, publicly shared their journey out of evangelicalism. Their spiritual deconstruction series has tens of millions of views and articulates questions many young evangelicals have been afraid to ask. They weren't rebelling, they were thinking. And the more they thought, the more the structure crumbled. The church's response to this exodus has been largely defensive. Instead of examining the systemic issues driving young people away, many leaders double down, blame secular culture, blame parents for not being strict enough, blame young people for being entitled and wanting Christianity without commitment. What they won't do is look in the mirror. Some churches are trying to adapt. Progressive Christianity exists. Churches that affirm LGBTQ members, that ordain women, that engage with science, that acknowledge systemic racism, that practice financial transparency. But in the Bible Belt, these churches are often marginalized, viewed as compromising the gospel, as giving in to culture rather than standing firm on truth. Young people in conservative areas might not even know these alternatives exist. The generational wealth of knowledge and tradition that churches represent is real. The community support, the rituals that mark life transitions, the ethical framework, the sense of belonging, these aren't nothing. Many people leaving evangelicalism describe grief. They're not happy to leave. They're mourning the loss of community, the loss of certainty, the loss of a framework that explained their existence and purpose. But they're making the difficult choice to leave anyway because staying means endorsing or participating in systems they now recognize as harmful.